on this Saturday morning, March 9th. Oh, no, sorry, March 8th. I should have my glasses on. Is a fellow who's written several books, and his area of expertise is game shows. So the answer to the question, who is our guest in the neighborhood, is who is Adam Nedeff. And Adam, welcome to Dave's
Thank,
Gone By. How you doing?
thank you very much, and thank you for the very game showy introduction. I always love it when a host does that.
Yes,
Very thoughtful.
unfortunately, we don't have any prizes for you to take home. We don't have the home edition of the Dave's Gone By board game,
uh,
but we do have you there. Is that I can't? Is that a traffic light to your?
yeah, yes, yeah. This has nothing to do with game shows, but you see the neighborhood trolley behind me. That was the one on the top shelf was built by my grandfather. Because I was a Mister Rogers fan when I was a very, very little kid. So a friend of mine gave me a traffic light to go with the trolley a few Christmases ago. So yeah, my whole world is just this is definitely the apartment of somebody who grew up watching too much TV because you'll find just relics of game shows and Mister Rogers and David Letterman and just all kinds of stuff. I This is a guy who has one very narrow hobby who lives in this apartment, and you could tell that just from walking in here.
Oh, no, it's one. I mean, I grew up in that generation too, right? I'm a little
Yeah,
older than you, but I'm also of the people complain now that all kids do and
yeah,
teenagers do is they look at their phones, they scroll, they scroll, they scroll. They can spend 2 hours just
yeah,
looking at 90-second video, and we make fun of that. And we, as a teacher, I despair over it. And yet, I was somebody who would plunk my ass down, 4 o'clock after school, and game show,
yeah.
cartoon, game
Exactly. Yeah,
show. You know.
yeah. I mean, that was always my summer too, because I grew up in that sweet spot where the game shows were still on the networks in the morning, but then the cable channels had game show reruns in the afternoon. So my entire summer day was just a wall of game shows. And, it was my mother always had to lay down the law and tell me to go outside and get fresh air. I had to be told to do that. Otherwise, it would have been game shows until sunset.
Fresh air is overrated. Where did you grow up? In New York, New Jersey? Where were you?
I grew up in a little town called Vienna, West Virginia. It's right on the West
Oh.
Virginia Ohio border, right on the Ohio River.
So basically,
And
you're not even breathing fresh air. You're breathing coal dust. It's
pretty
not,
much, yeah.
there's no fresh air to breathe.
Yeah.
You're breathing dead miner cells off their bodies, is essentially all you're breathing in West Virginia. So, what was your favorite game show as a child? Did you have a favorite?
My favorite growing up was Wheel of Fortune. My grandfather, in fact, saw that I loved Wheel of Fortune so much. He made a little toy Wheel of Fortune for me out of some cardboard and a nut and a bolt, and drew some wedges on it for me and wrote the numbers on it for me. But I have and still have a little toy Wheel of Fortune. I've got it on a bookshelf in the other room. And so Wheel of Fortune was my early favorite thing. And I've talked about this with other game show fans. We're all kind of in agreement with this. People who are obsessed with game shows like me had a leg up with reading when we started school. And I really do believe that comes directly from watching game shows. I grew up watching Wheel of Fortune, and you learn your letters very quickly from that show, and you learn what sounds they make, and you learn how they go into words. And then I also was a fan of Super Password growing up, so I learned word association. I learned what words meant. So different things like that. I really do believe I learned a lot of stuff real early from watching game shows, and I don't think that's a coincidence, having spoken to a lot of my friends about that. We all had a head start with reading and writing when we started school because of watching game shows.
And we think, we're told that, oh, no, it was Sesame Street. It was the electric company. It wasn't really. You're right. Because
Yeah.
I already knew how to read. And when I was watching Sesame Street, I already knew the letters. They weren't
Yeah.
teaching me that. I learned a couple of Spanish words from Sesame. And electric company, I enjoyed the electric company. But I knew vowel sounds. I knew how to make words and letters. I was just enjoying the shows. Probably I
Exactly.
got more out of, out of game shows in terms of knowledge and learning and putting things together. Maybe you're right about that. So what happened, though, there was sort of a game show American Renaissance. I guess now it goes back maybe 20 years when you had things like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and they went back into prime time. Now we've definitely seen that falling off, and reality sort of contest shows have taken over for game shows. What do you think? We had that rise and then kind of senescence of the game show era recently.
Success breeds imitation. So what happened? Obviously, a super Who Wants to Be a Millionaire was the catalyst, like you said, and so we had the other game shows, the other networks jumping on the bandwagon with game shows. So that's how we got The Weakest Link. NBC tried, 21 for a while. CBS had Winning Lines, and so things kept going until we got. Deal or No Deal. Eventually, NBC struck gold with that, and so we had that. We had that boom period, and it's not faded away. It hasn't tapered off. I think what's sort of tapered off is really the development of new game show ideas. What's happened in the last decade or so is you see very, very often new game shows are actually revivals or reworkings of past game shows. ABC in the summer of 2016 announces we're doing an entire night of game shows on our schedule. They called it Sunday Night Fun and Games, and it was Pyramid and Match Game and To Tell the Truth and Family Feud. And
True.
very
Yeah.
successful, very entertaining shows. But the thing is, especially in this day and age, this is not a world that rewards risk. There's a lot of trying to do what's already been done in the world of game shows and in the world of television in general, because it's a lot safer to say, let's do this thing that was on the air for 10 years and years ago, because we know that has an audience. We know that works. We know that it's going to
And
find
there's
an
also a
audience again if we do
nostalgia
it again.
factor. There's also a
Exactly,
thing of
yeah.
like the parents who are 50 remember watching those shows, and now they'll bring their children. Everybody can sit around watching TV. There's no sex and violence, although now there's probably dirty jokes in them hidden,
Yeah.
and
And
that's okay.
so,
But yeah,
this is the knock on game shows has always been it attracts an older audience. The elderly people watch game shows. And that is true, but at the same time, the plus side to that nobody really touches on is you hear people say all the time, I remember watching the show with my grandparents. I remember watching the show
yes,
with my grandma. And so, yes, game shows attract an older audience, but also it causes this new generation of game show fans to latch onto these shows and these formats. So, thank God they attract an older audience, because what ends up happening is they share it with the next generation beyond that.
that's absolutely true. And what people also don't realize is like I think in syndication, like Meredith Vieira is hosting still Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. It didn't go away. Right, I think there's still new episodes of these kinds of shows happening. They're just not on the
Meredith,
regular schedule. Yeah, I
no,
think.
Jimmy Kimmel is now hosting Millionaire when they do Millionaire. Meredith Vieira does have a show. She has a wonderful show actually called 25 Words or Less, which is one of the best game shows to come along in the past decade. I really don't like phrases like this, but it's really a good thing to entice people to watch a show. If you like Password, if you like Pyramid, you'll like 25 Words or Less. It is a very well done, very entertaining word association game. It's based on a board game from the 1990s, and they've started churning out new editions of this board game because of the success of the show. But it's just a really well done, really simple, really easy to follow game of word association and communication, and it's fantastic. And Meredith Vieira, that's one of the big surprises and yet not surprises, is the fact that this woman left journalism and became a really good game show host and a very successful, very entertaining woman to watch as a game show host, to switch careers like that and shift gears very abruptly. But at the same time, you look back at TV's past and who hosted the game shows in the 1950s and the 1960s? Well, Mike Wallace and Hugh Downs.
Right.
Mike Wallace hosted The Big Surprise and Who Pays, and you had Hugh Downs hosting Concentration for about a decade.
Yeah, and also you have like celebrities, sometimes actors. Look at Alec Baldwin.
Yeah,
I think he's going to be hosting a new game show called "Is This Loaded," which is
yeah. Well,
no, but,
That's one of the things that's I think has kind of come from the social media era is a lot of people are a lot of the decision makers. I should specify that a lot of the decision makers are concerned with spreading awareness, spreading relevance right away, and knowing that there's going to be an audience built into a format. So there's I've been told I'm never in the pitch meetings. I'm not on that level of game show production, but I've been told that there are frequently people in the meetings for proposing a new game show. So who's going to host this? They want to know the host before they even buy the
Oh,
show.
Lord.
And the decision about who to hire as a host, often what factors into it is what kind of presence they have on social media, who's following them on social media, who are their followers, how many followers do they have, uh, who's going to be enticed to watch. And I get it, but also at the same time, the thing is, if you hire a host for their fan base and you put a show on the air because of who your host is, that's going to work, but it's going to work for one episode. People will watch it once because of who the host is, but the thing about a game show is the game is the star of the
Yep.
show.
Yep.
If the game doesn't have legs, people aren't going to watch it more than once. So I
I mean,
get it, but also there's a reason that it doesn't work.
that's why I wanted to get your take on post Trebek Jeopardy. I think they absolutely went with the right decision of Ken Jennings. I mean, I thought Ken
Yes.
Jennings was absolutely the right host, but the show still was okay under Mayim Bialik, and it was actually watchable under Aaron Rodgers in a way. But yeah, because the show, right? What were your
Yeah.
thoughts, post Trebekistan?
The game is the star. I think Ken was the right choice because Jeopardy is a very different animal in the world of game shows. And I think one of the things that has made Jeopardy work is the ability to believe that the person presenting this information knows the information. Um, this goes back to Art Fleming. Art Fleming used to say that people would tap him on his shoulder in restaurants and ask him to settle arguments for them. They'd be having some sort of disagreement about a fact at one of the other tables, and they would see Art Fleming was in the restaurant, and they'd reason, oh, well, Art Fleming will know this. So that is the perception of the host of Jeopardy going all the way back to the 1960s. And so the reason Ken Jennings was a great choice was here's a guy that won 74 games of Jeopardy as a contestant. You can watch Jeopardy and believe that this guy reading the clues would be able to give the correct answer and has a lot of sense and a lot of deep knowledge about what he's telling the contestants and what he's telling the viewers. So I think Ken was a perfect choice for that. And he's somebody that the fans already knew. And he was somebody, and again, this goes back to that social media presence. You know, Ken has a presence on social media. Ken is a published author and became a published author as a result of Jeopardy. So Ken came it's full circle. Ken had an audience for his projects after he was a contestant on Jeopardy, and now Ken brings that audience with him to come on to Jeopardy and become the host. And so, yeah, it's a perfect. The seed got planted 25 years ago, and now they're making the best of it by making him the host of the show. Not 25 years ago. I think I jumped it a little bit, maybe
Yes.
22 years ago. But yeah, I mean, you're looking and it's easy to forget that. It's so crazy how the passage of time speeds by. It's been more than 20 years since Ken was on Jeopardy.
Wow. Okay, I think you're right.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
because I actually wrote a song called Jeopardy Can. When it was played on the Dr. Demento show. Quite honestly, Jeopardy, and it was to the Beatles' Bungalow Bill, and it was like, "Hey
Yeah.
Jeopardy Can," because and that was a long time ago. So I guess
Mhm.
it was probably 2 decades. But let me ask you, you've written all these books about Bill Collin and Alan Ludden and folks like that. Is there an Art Fleming book in you? Whatever happened? Nobody talks about everybody. Alex Trebek. Alex Trebek. Nobody remembers that Art Fleming was Jeopardy for so many years.
I'm not going to say never say never. I'm not going to say no, never say never. I'm not. I'm not going to say never say never as a double or triple negative. I'm not going to say no to the idea of Art Fleming. There's Here's the tricky part about writing a book, and this is already something that's come up with writing one of my other books. When I wrote, and hold on, I always have these at the ready in case we want to do these. There, when I when I wrote my book about Dennis James, okay, Dennis James, Lifetime of First, available wherever you find books online. Um, when I started writing that one, his wife said at the very beginning of it, "Who are you going to talk to? Everybody my husband knew is dead." Um, and yeah, I think I only interviewed maybe five or six people for that book.
Oh.
Um, on the other hand, when I wrote my book about Bill Cullen,
Show the book.
Quizmaster, now
Yeah, it is.
available in its second edition. People came out of the woodwork to say, yeah, I knew Bill, I worked with him, and his wife gave me a slew of people that he knew and worked with, and I was able to interview them. And for the second edition, I was still tracking down people who knew Bill. A lot of Bill's friends have been blessed with long lives, so you're able to put together a good book with that.
Well, which
Art
is, let me
Fleming is
ask you as a writer, which is easier, having just 4 or 5 interviews to incorporate into the book and then everything else is just research, or having to corral 3 dozen interviews and sources and things and write a book and put that all together in something that isn't
well,
700 pages?
to my experience, corralling makes it easier. Having scores of interviews makes it a lot easier because when you're able to talk to people who knew the subject of the book very, very well and very, very personally, when you have a lot of people to grab from, you're able to get a better sense of what was important in that person's life and what doesn't matter. So you can discard certain facts because they may be relevant to that person's life, but you find out, okay, that's not the most important thing. That's not something to fixate on. But as you're interviewing more and more people, when you hear them touch on the same subjects repeatedly, you think to yourself, okay, that's something that I need to mention for the
Mm.
book. That's something that's worth talking about with this subject.
Oh, can I ask why was Dennis James your first? Which was your first book about game shows?
My first
Or
book about game
close?
shows actually was hold on. There we go.
Oh, yeah.
I'm glad I did this. This day in game show history.
Oh,
That was
yeah.
my first book in game shows, and that's a very different one because it's not a biography. When I first decided to write game shows, I was inspired by a series of books called Uncle John's Bathroom Reader, which is a series of books that are just brief articles on a variety of subjects. And I thought it would be interesting to write a series of essays about the history of game shows. So that was the first book that I wrote. It turned into this was the great thing. I was able to pad my resume in a way that I wasn't expecting. I thought it would be a feather in my cap to write one book. But with all the photos and with all the text submitted to the publisher said this isn't going to fit in one book, so he split it up into 4 books.
Whoa.
And so right away I could say, oh yes, I'm the author of 4 books on the history of game shows, having just written one that turned out to be a beast.
Who's your publisher,
Um,
by the way? Was it Bear Manor? Who's your
Bear
publisher?
Manor Media,
Yeah,
yes, a
yeah.
wonderful publisher who I would recommend to anybody who's looking to write about pop culture, especially esoteric pop culture, or pop culture that has become esoteric. What I always point out to people was the same month that I got published for the first time by Bear Manor Media, the other book that they had come out was a biography of Jay Silverheels. Uh,
Oh, the Lone Ranger
so
guy.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So I mean, that's the kind of publisher they are. Those are the kinds of books that they'll publish. So yes, if there's a pop culture specialty that you want to write a book on, reach out to Bear Manor Media. They might be able to help you out and
Wow. Nice.
send you on your way to becoming an author.
And are they the publisher of most or all of your other book where you do
Almost
these
all. The only one, and outside, another publisher got in touch with me about writing Game Shows FAQ. Another fine book in the Adam Neda family of game show books,
of course.
and the only one that I don't have a card for. But yeah, Game Shows FAQ is from another publisher, but Bear Manor Media has been a wonderful, supportive partner in my endeavor for the past decade, and I'm looking forward to continuing to churn stuff out for them.
So let me ask you, what is something that we wouldn't expect about Alan Ludden? You wrote a book about him. He was married to Betty White. He, of course, did Password all those years, often with her on the panel. Tell us a story about Alan Ludden.
He's a big advocate for the youth of America. Alan was not just an advocate for boosting education, but was also just a big advocate for respecting kids and doing things to benefit them. Alan spearheaded some legislation in the state of Connecticut to boost the prison sentences for drug dealers who sold to minors. For example, he had a radio show called Mind Your Manners. And the show, Mind Your Manners, the premise of the show show was a panel of teenagers, and he specifically cast the popular kids in school. And the point of it was a show where teenagers could write to for advice, and the popular kids in school, the ones who had their own cliques and the ones that the other kids secretly wanted to be, would respond and give advice to the ones who they probably wouldn't talk
nerds.
to in school, or the ones
Right.
that were, the ones who were too shy. It was a wonderful premise for a show, and he ended up making contact with a kid who was in juvenile hall for a drug offense, and it led to this legislation that boosted the sentences for drug dealers who focused on minors. Um, he also wrote a series of books called Plain Talk. And it was very straightforward advice for young people. And it's actually rather shocking to read these books now and read some of the advice that he gives to them. One of them was a book called Plain Talk for Women Under 21. So the target audience was women in their late teens, girls in their late teens. And there's a section of this book where Alan talks about why he's against the idea of saving it for marriage, which, how many books do you think people were writing about that in the 1940s?
Wow. Yeah.
But he writes this whole passage in this book for teenage girls where he says a woman who stays away from men is going to be emotionally underdeveloped by the time she decides to settle down and start finding a relationship that'll last. Whereas a woman who plays the field is going to have a well-rounded series of experiences with a lot of different men that are going to give her a guideline to what actually matters to her and what she's actually
Wow.
attracted to and who she's actually attracted to.
Yeah.
So yeah, Alan's advice was, go nuts, ladies.
Yeah. I think we know that he and Betty were probably going
Yeah.
on it long before they were, He's probably smelling his fingers every time he did. No, I don't know what
Yeah.
that means. What about? Let's see. Who you've written about Bill Cullen? Any cool, funny Bill Cullen stories?
Mel Brooks had a fabulous story. I didn't get a chance to talk to Mel Brooks, but just in the last year, Mel Brooks has suddenly been telling this story about Bill Cullen. Mel had been a guest on one of Bill's game shows in the late 1960s. And the thing that you hear about Bill a lot, which is sort of presented as an odd fact about Bill, is Bill had polio, and Bill had limited mobility as a result of that. I find that the severity of of his illness is a little over exaggerated. Like you'll see people online to this day say Bill couldn't walk, or he had to walk with assistance, or he had to walk with a cane. And I have raw footage of Bill doing shoots for Good Morning America when they interviewed him, and you see Bill walking. And basically, the severity of Bill's disability is, if you didn't know what was wrong with him, you would think his foot's asleep. That's as
Oh,
bad as it
so he
looks.
limped a little.
But
Yeah, right.
yeah,
Yeah.
he limped a little. Um, but the fact that he was disabled was something that was not commonly shared with the public. Bill said later that he didn't want it to be a gimmick. He didn't want it to be a selling point. I'm the host who's disabled. I'm the host who bravely overcame it. He didn't want to sell it for himself. So he really, really kind of downplayed the fact that he had this disability. Well, as a result, Mel Brooks did not know that Bill Cullen was disabled.
Oh.
So they come to a point in the show where there's a break in taping, and Bill gets up to walk over to talk to somebody, and Bill does this limp. And Mel thinks he's doing a funny walk to get a laugh. So he gets
Oh.
up and walks behind Bill in front of the audience and
Oh.
starts doing this flip floppy walk, making fun of the way Bill is walking, and it gets this laugh. And the other celebrity on the show that day is just looking horrified at him and just yells, "He has polio. Don't do that." And Bill turned around and saw what he was doing. And so Mel has already realized, oh my God, I'm making fun of a disabled person. And so just in an instant, Mel wants to crawl into a hole and die. And Bill sees what he's doing. And Bill laughs and hugs him and says, you're the only person that's ever had the guts to make fun of my crippled walk. And he says, everybody is always so careful not to say anything about it. And so Bill actually appreciated it. Bill got a kick out of it in a way that Mel wasn't expecting. So Mel has said in the years since that was the most embarrassing moment of his entire career, but Bill was graceful about it and had a sense of humor about it, and it's become this
Oh, that's
favorite
great.
story of Mel Brooks's to share.
every comedian needs to hear that story. Just because that's what we do. It's like we push the envelope. I was talking about this earlier in the show. We push the envelope and we say shit that we take crap for, and we go too far, and we just want to be told, "Oh, you went a little too far," but we love you for it. That's what we expect you to do. You're being funny, and it's okay. It doesn't always work out like that, but yeah.
Yeah.
So also, you've written a book about Gene Rayburn.
Yes. Gene Rayburn, hold on. Let's get that plug up there. Yes,
Match game, Gene Rayburn, man.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yep. And that's actually one of my biggest sellers. And this is, we were talking earlier about the reboots of game shows, and this is why I'm grateful that the reboots happened. Was ABC introduced a reboot of Match Game in 2016 that we talked about earlier, and I used to love checking my sales data on Amazon every time they aired an episode of their new version of Match Game. I'm not joking about this. I sold copies of this book every time an episode of Match Game aired, because people would watch it. It would remind them of the old version, I guess, and they would look it up they would either Google it or they would go to Amazon and try to find information about it, and they'd find my book. So I don't know who at ABC specifically I should have been sending flowers to, but yeah, there was a stretch of 5 or 6 years where every time ABC aired an episode of Match Game, I sold a chunk of books on Amazon.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yes. So, is there anything about Gene Rayburn that would surprise us?
Hosting Match Game was really the second act of his life and his career, and the first act, somebody used this comparison, and it seems wild to compare him this way, but it really is true when you learn about it. They called Gene Rayburn the Howard Stern of the 1940s, and that is not an exaggeration. Gene was a superstar in radio. Gene was one of the people that really helped pioneer what radio became when television started to take over the world. Gene hosted this show along with another disc jockey named Dee Finch. They had a morning radio show in New York, and it was the invention of the format where it's 4 hours of music, but also the guys are bantering and doing sketches in between.
The zoo.
And
The zoo kind of thing. Yeah.
yeah.
Wow.
And Gene, they would do weird publicity stunts, like they made themselves available for rent. And so they did this show one morning where the woman who had rented them out had hired them to clean her apartment. So they did this radio show from this apartment that they were cleaning from top to bottom while they were on the air hosting the show. So stunts like they were doing publicity stunts like that.
And we see that all the way into Letterman and Conan too of that kind of idea. Start with wow.
But yeah, Gene Rayburn was absolutely the king of New York radio for a stretch of about 5 or 6 years.
Wow.
Just a superstar, and like you said, the zoo format. He was one of the guys that turned radio into what it became after television took its place.
I got to read your Gene Rayburn book, probably before all the others, except you have done a book about one of the most legendary programs in all of television history. I think you know which one I'm about to mention. It is The Gong Show. You're not the only person to write about The Gong Show, but what did you contribute to Gong Show lore? What did you dig up that hasn't been in the movies, what hasn't been in other people's books about Chuck Barris and so forth? What did you find?
I found that pretty much was not telling the truth about the CIA, although there's still a surprise there, which was, okay, so Chuck writes this book where he claims that he was a CIA agent and assassin for hire during the time that he was producing game shows, and the game shows that he created were his front for the killings. And having talked to members of his staff and talked to people who were there at the time, no. But one of the surprises that I discovered along the way was possibly Chuck's motive/inspiration for writing this book was, oddly enough, he did apply for a job at the CIA in the late 1950s and made it far enough along in the process that for a brief period, he had access to certain rooms of the CIA offices. And eventually he got an offer from ABC Network, and he went in the ABC Network direction instead of the CIA direction. But Chuck actually did almost become a CIA agent. So
not quite the same as being
Yeah,
Being an assassin, though. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
but the funny thing was the way his staff reacted to it was they all read this book, and one of his staffers, Mike Metzger, who only passed away very, very recently, and was a wonderful man. It was great talking to him. But Mike Metzger was one who said he kept it going for Chuck. Because what all the staffers that I interviewed said was for years afterwards, especially after that book came out and after the movie came out, you would mention that you had worked on the Gong Show or that you would work on the dating game. That you mentioned that you worked for Chuck Barris, and people would always say, "So was he?" And Mike Metzger said, I would always answer by saying something like, "Oh no, that story's not true." It's the only really weird thing about Chuck was he never came in on Thursdays for some reason. I don't know why, but he was never in. And then on Friday morning he would say something about, "Yeah, I had a busy day in Stockholm yesterday," and it's like, wow, why did he fly to Stockholm, Sweden for one day? And Chuck also had this really weird gun in his desk, but other than the weird gun and the fact that he was never in his office on Thursday. But like you'd see people's eyes just pop out while he was telling the story. And he said that was his way of keeping it up. Was he would say it wasn't true, but then he would drop all these hints in the conversation that, oh yeah, Chuck actually was sneaking off behind our backs. And he said it was fun to do that. And he said he had a chance to tell Chuck before he died. Oh, by the way, Chuck, I keep
Oh.
this going for you. And Chuck really got a kick out of that. That he made it a point to keep the story going.
Let me ask him. We're talking to Adam Nedeff, who's obviously the author of all these books about game shows. Do you have a favorite Gong Show segment of all time? Your favorite?
You know what? Yes, there actually is a favorite Gong Show segment of me of all time. The act's name was Wilbur Hall, and it's the thing about Gong Show acts is they never sound like much when you describe them, or they're too abstract. But I'll go ahead and describe this. Wilbur Hall was a violinist who played Pop Goes the Weasel. And the gimmick was throughout the performance, he kept changing up the way that he was playing the song. So he's playing it on the violin with his bow. And at one point, he stops and he changes the way he's playing. So he's holding the bow still and he's moving the violin back and forth. And he's playing Pop Goes the Weasel that way. And at one point, he stands up and he flips the violin upside down and he drags it across the back of the chair. And he's able to produce the sound of Pop Goes the Weasel by dragging the violin across the top of the chair. And that's the thing. He just plays Pop Goes the Weasel continuously, but every time he starts the song over again, he changes the way he's playing it.
That's
And
great. That's
Chuck
post
mentions,
Hendrix. What? Sorry.
yeah,
Yeah.
and Chuck mentions during the course of his act that this guy is 82 years old, and I was watching this and thinking to myself, it's what a weird thing for an 82-year-old guy to do. So I did some research on 82-year-old Wilbur Hall, and found him doing exactly his Gong Show act in a movie from 1930. And it just put a smile on my face, realizing this is a guy who played vaudeville and toured the country, and for a time in his life, made a career out of crisscrossing the country and just playing Pop Goes the Weasel for 3 months, for 3 minutes a
Yeah. Yeah.
night. And this guy watched the Gong Show on TV when it first premiered and thought to himself, I can do my act again. And so he went into the closet, pulled out his old tuxedo,
Yes.
and went down and auditioned to perform his act one more time on television. And that just kind of puts a smile on your face to realize that that was the magic of the Gong Show. It wasn't just the fact that they had all these zany, weird acts, but just the idea that everybody got a chance. This guy got one more chance to be a star and be in the
Yes.
spotlight. And anybody had a chance to do it. It's really important to try to contextualize this for the youngins these days. The youngins these days. I'm 42, so I can now say that. But really, the Gong Show was YouTube of 1976. What folks now don't really realize or think about is there was a time when our access to entertainment was three networks that were just surrounded by gatekeepers, and that was your only in to get to a wide audience. Today, if you want to attract a wide audience, all you really, really need is a sense of commitment and a phone. And you can produce and you can make everything that you need is somewhere in your apartment if you want to be discovered now. It wasn't like that in 1976. And the magic of the Gong Show and what it should be celebrated for now is that it was a venue in 1976 where people had access to these television networks that they wouldn't have had access to otherwise. The TV networks were not going to tell you, yeah, come on in, we'll put you on the air. But here was this 30-minute chunk of the day where somebody, the host and creator, actually was saying, yes, come on, you can use my space and perform for a while.
And no, that's it's fun. I mean, it also goes back to the Apollo before then, and
Yeah.
I don't know if Arthur Godfrey had intentionally quote unquote bad or weird acts on, but certainly even when they have people like Bill Hung who appears on what was that the voice show, the singing
American Idol.
American Idol.
American
I mean,
Idol,
American
yeah.
Idol took from the Gong Show because American Idol knows that people want to see someone who knocks them out singing, Susan Boyle, but they also need as a relief a guy who plays Pop Goes the Weasel in weird ways. They need that balance, and they're both
Exactly, yeah. And the Gong Show was the same way. Chuck said, the formula was, an occasional good act sprinkled in. And the Gong Show did discover new talent. And the Gong Show did present a forum for new talent. The most conspicuous example would be Paul Rubens, Pee Wee Herman. And Paul really, really did a good job of articulating how important the Gong Show was to his life in interviews later in life. Because here's a way that the Gong Show was different, and here's how it benefited Paul Rubens. A lot of game shows, you've got your one shot at it, and that's it. The Gong Show rules were different. The rule on the Gong Show was you could be on the Gong Show as many times as you wanted. The only catch was you had to audition for the show every time that you wanted to be on it. They weren't just going to give you carte blanche. You had to come in on audition as if you had never been on the show in your life. And also you had to do something different every time you auditioned for the show. And so Paul Rubens kept brainstorming ideas for different acts, and altogether he was on the show 14 times. Now, the motivation to be a contestant on the Gong Show 14 times was this. Chuck Barris was very, very nervous that the show would just run out of acts and that people would stop auditioning for it. So he felt that he needed to have an incentive. And so one of the incentives that he came up with was he made a deal with the performers unions, SAG and AFTRA, to pay scale, which is basically minimum wage for a performer in television, which is several $100s. He would pay scale to anybody who was a member of the union. So what that did was it attracted a lot of young, starving artists to the Gong Show to be contestants on the show, because win or lose, because of scale, you knew you were going to get the rent paid that month if you were a contestant on the Gong Show. So Paul Rubens was on 14 times, and he was paid scale for each of his performances. But then Chuck sells the Gong Show rerun package into syndication after 2 years. And the thing about syndication rights is you have to pay royalties to the acts that are on the show if they're members of SAG and AFTRA. So Paul Rubens, as he told the story, he was looking for a day job in 1978 because he wasn't getting the bills paid. And suddenly he gets this huge check in the mail from Chuck Barris, and he had just sold the Gong Show reruns into syndication for the first time. So it was this huge chunk of money accounting for the first few times that Paul Rubens' appearances would rerun on television. And Paul Rubens said the check that he got in the mail was enough to live on for a while. So he called off his search for his second job, and he was able to devote a lot of his time and a lot of his energy to developing his stage show, which is where we get Pee Wee Herman from. And you can say with a straight face, we got Pee Wee Herman because of the Gong Show.
That is so. I love that. And it makes me. I mean, I don't know if you know this story, but it's similar and it's happy and sad at the same time. It's kind of when you were talking about, again, the violin guy from the 1930s and Pee Wee. There's also the story of, and we mentioned Jimmy Kimmel before, that, the street performer Wildman Fisher? Have you ever heard of him from like the Zappa era? And
it's not a name that jumps to mind.
He was never really a star, but he was part of the Frank Zappa label, and Zappa produced his first album, and he was, a very weird kind of outsider singer-songwriter artist, but also impossible to deal with because he was paranoid schizophrenic, but people kept him going, and Rhino recorded him for a while and so forth, and he was forgotten, but because he was so crazy and impossible to deal with, he was also borderline homeless, right? And then years later, when he's just been kind of living hand to mouth, as it were, and he gets on this Jimmy Kimmel Star Search segment that they did probably about 15 years ago now, where just people come on kind of like Gong Show, and suddenly Kimmel announces, oh, here's Larry Fisher. And he does one of his songs, and it actually goes pretty well. And I'm sure Fisher thought, hey, this is going to be my next, I'm going to be known again. I'm going to have this next career. Nothing really comes of it because he's Wildman. But it always sort of broke my heart that he was introduced as just another act. That whether Kimmel himself or any of his staffers knew that this wasn't just some guy with a very funny voice and very weird songs, but this is Wildman Fisher. He is kind of this outsider artist legend. And they're just kind of, well, here's Larry Fisher, here's our next up, and he does this song and he goes. That kind of hurt me. That it's great that we have this footage, the last really great footage of Wildman Fisher, but at the same time, it's kind of like, oh, you know, if they knew who he was and what he represented back in 1967, you know, or 1971 and stuff.
You know, oddly enough, the one analogy that you can kind of make to the Gong Show there is the unknown comic. And this is what's funny is because of the success of that character, people have kind of forgotten what the unknown comic was before he was on the Gong Show. The unknown comic was a guy named Murray Langston. And Murray Langston was a rather successful actor for a few years. He did variety shows, he did sitcoms, but Murray Langston was getting a lot of work, and then the worst thing that happens to an actor. He hit a dry spell for a while and he wasn't working. And so the Gong Show was on television and he found out that this is the show that pays scale to the contestants. So if you're a contestant, but he sort of second guessed it and he thought to himself, okay, if my family sees me on the Gong Show, they're going to assume that something's gone way wrong in my life. And it kind of had because he wasn't working. So he came up with this act called The Unknown Comic, and the whole point of The Unknown Comic was he was wearing the bag over his head. People wouldn't realize that our friend Murray is a contestant on The Gong Show. Oh my God, he must have money troubles. So that was why Murray Langston came up with The Unknown Comic Act, was so that people wouldn't see his face when he was a contestant on The Gong Show. And then it caught fire in a way that nothing he had ever done as a performer had caught on. And you know, he said, here I am 40, 45 years later, and I'm still putting that bag on my head for gigs. Like, the unknown comic became a star in a way that Murray Langston hadn't. Yeah.
And he's alive and well. I mean, he's on my
Alive and
Facebook
well,
feed.
and
Yeah.
has had a great career, yeah.
So let me ask, speaking of careers, we haven't really talked about the fact that you have got jobs behind the scenes
Yeah.
in game shows. How did that come about? And what shows have you been on? And what do you actually do?
Well, happily, a lot of the books that I wrote in the first few years fell into the laps of people who made the hiring decisions. And that was entirely the reason that I wrote the books was game shows are, and a lot of television works this way. A lot of show business works this way. It's who you know, and I didn't have a network of people. So I wrote the books to get my name out there, and it finally did work. In 2016, I got a job offer from somebody who read one of my books and who owned one of my books. So I've worked behind the scenes on shows like Double Dare, College Bowl, Idiot Test, Funny You Should Ask. A lot of shows. So more shows than there are stars in the sky. And
No. But what were you actually do? Like physically, were you
Yeah.
you weren't stringing lights? Were you in the writer's room? Were you coming up with what were you doing?
So sometimes I'm hired to write questions. I've worked on shows where I've done graphics. The job that I'm hired for more than any other is researcher. And the simplest way to describe researcher is if you're watching a game show and a contestant gives kind of an iffy answer and the host says, I need a ruling from our judges on this. That's me. I'm judges. Yeah. And the way this works is we spend usually 10 or 11 weeks is the length of the job, but we go through the material that the writers have written and we read up on the subject of the question. We read up on the fact being asserted in the question and we verify, is this true? And we verify, is this question written in a way that anything else is correct? And so we have that information ready. We try to gather that info and have it all in one place so people can check it if it comes up. And that's really my job is I don't write the questions, but I'm the second set of eyes who looks at the questions and says, okay, is there anything that we missed here? And I dig into it and see if there's any other answer for it.
So if there is this thing like when these shows are actually being taped, tapably live, if we say so, and then the contestant gives an answer that is kind of on. And it seemingly has to be in like 5 seconds. It has to get into the ear of the moderator of like, is this acceptable or not? Is that are they literally calling you, or is there time that's extra time that's taken that we just don't see on the air where they give you like 5 minutes or something?
Both. If it's subject matter where I'm comfortable making an instant decision and the contestant's answer is such that I'm able to make an instant ruling on this, uh, I can give them the thumbs up or thumbs down right away. Like, we had a question once. Um, the city. This is not exactly the question, but the gist of it was it comes from a Native American term meaning the good land. And the answer, as anybody who has seen the movie Wayne's World knows, is Milwaukee. So Milwaukee's name means the good land. And uh, contestant answered Philadelphia. And I just immediately got on the headset and said, "Call it wrong. We know that's wrong." And that was just because Philadelphia was something that I knew off the top of my head. Philadelphia literally means brotherly love. That's why it's called the city of brotherly love. Um, so in that case, I was able to make an instant ruling and say, yes, this is wrong. In other cases, it is a chunk of time that you don't see. If contestants give an answer that we're not ready for, um, like we had a question about artificial sweeteners, and it was a show where the contestants wrote their answers. And here's kind of the magic trick to a show where the contestants write their answers. It's the person making the judgment call has a secret screen where we can see what they're writing as they're writing it. And what I noticed was the contestants were not writing the scientific names or the generic names. They were writing brand names. And I looked
Oh,
down and I realized we didn't have anything about brand names. So they were writing down like NutraSweet.
right.
And
Yeah.
the answer that we had was aspartame. And I'll tell you right this second, I can't remember if aspartame is the same thing as NutraSweet or if it's the other one. But that was one of we had to stop tape while I checked and I saw, okay, is NutraSweet the same as aspartame or is this another
And if it is,
sweetener?
you have
But
to
yeah,
give them that. Yeah, I
right,
can.
yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I do
So,
remember I got really, really angry many, 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 many years ago. Maybe I'm misremembering this, but there was they were answering a question, a contestant about an Ibsen play, and the contestant said The Doll's House, and they were marked wrong because it was A Doll's House, and they didn't get it right. But it's a translation of a Swedish name.
yeah.
And to say that the or to get the article wrong, I was a little pissed. I thought they should have.
The funny thing was they just on Pop Culture Jeopardy, the new spinoff that they have on Amazon Prime, they had a clue about a movie, and contestant gave an answer that they ruled incorrect. And then during a break, they looked it up, and what they found out was the correct response that the incorrect response that the contestant had given was the name that the movie had in its preview screening at a film festival right when it first premiered. So not the name that it had in general release, but like
Right,
this
but
one screening that it had the first time that it was shown to critics. So they flipped the thumb and said, "Okay, yes, you can. We'll give you credit for that." Um, but yeah, translations are that's the most interesting problem that we run into sometimes. We had to kill a question about Pandora because of a translation issue that I did not know about this until one of my coworkers dug into it, which is what did Pandora open?
a
And
box
a
or
box. But it turns out box is the result of a mistranslation. It was actually Pandora's jar.
really?
And the problem, yeah, and so there was a discussion about this, and the feeling was, okay, the world knows it as Pandora's box, but we can't take it because box is definitely wrong. It was a jar that she opened up. But you can't have the host ask that and say, "Oh, sorry, I know the entire world knows that it's Pandora's
Yeah,
box, but it's
of
actually a
course.
jar." It's bad television, and that's one of the things that questions get killed for sometimes. Is we're not looking for strictly right or wrong answers. We want engaging material that the audience wants to play along with, and they're satisfied by the payoff of it. So Pandora's jar is the fact, but we didn't use this question because the feeling was a viewer is going to hate this if they say box and we call them wrong and we explain this technicality. That's going to be bad TV. So we
Well,
got rid of the question for
what if
that
you
reason.
allow it, since it's the general, well, except it's technically wrong. That's what you're saying. Because you could say
Right.
Box is what everybody knows. But by the way, folks, it was
Yeah.
actually a jar. But box is technically wrong, so that makes a difficult. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. So
Yeah. Wow.
that's one of the things that we have to kill, and that's one of the things that we're looking for, and that's the nuance of doing game shows that I think people would be surprised about when they're talking about questions and answers. We're not strictly looking for facts; we're looking for things that make you, the viewer, talk back to your TV and want to talk back to your
Yeah.
TV and feel engaged by it. So if it's one of those situations like that where a viewer is going to be pissed off by the fact, we don't use that fact.
Let me ask just a couple more minutes here with our guest, Adam Nedeff. What show, if you can tell, are you working on now, or will you be working on in the next 3 weeks or months? Which game show are you on, or can you not say?
At this moment, I can say I'm working on Don't Forget the Lyrics for the Fox Network. We're about to tape the new season of that. We'll be going into the studio in April, and I'm not 100% certain when it aired, but the next time that you see new episodes of Don't Forget the Lyrics, you can say that I worked on that. Also, during the month of April, Game Show Network will be debuting two game shows that I worked on that shot last year, Bingo Blitz and a reboot of Tic Tac Dough.
Is Bingo Blitz actually like bingo?
With trivia, and your
Oh,
host is the lovely and talented Valerie Bertinelli.
oh my God! Oh wow!
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, all right, all right. So I guess you took that job one day at a time. But thank you very much. And what book or books are you currently working on?
Right now, I've got a book coming together for the museum that I'm involved with in Rochester. The Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, is developing a wing of the museum called the National Archives of Game Show History.
Oh,
And actually, if you go to their website right now, you can see some of the projects that we've already worked on. We've done a series of oral histories with legendary figures behind the scenes in the world of game shows. And so that's been a lot of fun. But the plan is in 2026 or 2027, we are going to introduce a physical space dedicated to the history of game shows. And right now
whoa!
I'm working on a museum book, basically, a book that ties into the museum and some of the things that have been donated to them.
You must feel so unbelievably lucky that literally the thing that you loved as a child, you are not only got a job in, but you've tentacled your way into all these different related jobs that are still about the thing you love. That is so ideal. I'm so fucking jealous of you. It's
I
amazing.
love game shows, and I'm very fortunate to say that they love me back. And
Ooh,
I'm
knock wood,
glad that I've
yeah.
been able to make something of this.
But let me ask you before I let you go, though. I did also notice. Are you I'm not, but are you a wrestling fan? Because I feel like you've written about.
I am a wrestling fan. I'm a lot more old school. I do follow the current product a bit, but I've always been a fan of the old school wrestling, the territory days, as they're called now, when you had different regions of the country that had their own pro wrestling. And so I have a certain affection for the different styles of wrestling that you saw in those different territories.
And you've written about. That's what I'm saying. You've written books about the
Not,
WWE.
I've written the books that I've written about wrestling are more collections of columns that I've written, but I've been writing for a website called 401 Mania for about 17 years now.
Whoa.
And it's really strictly a hobby, the writing that I do about wrestling. It was something I did to take my mind off the fact that I really, really hated being a telemarketer for the 3 months of my life that I was a telemarketer. It was they had an opening for writers, and so I submitted for this, so I would have something to do that wasn't that I would actually looking forward to after another damn day of being a telemarketer. But I've been doing that for 17 years, and it's really I just write recaps and reviews and opinions of wrestling shows from the 1980s, and just
Yeah.
here's what I thought of the show. Here's why I thought this worked. Here's why I thought this didn't work. And here's what became of the guys who were involved in the match.
So again, it's a level of nostalgia, but also a level of fun, and I mean it's so
Yeah.
cool. So let me ask the last question for Adam Nedeff is, you've got your little corner of the world where you write the books, where you go and you help with produce these game shows and such. What are your hobbies, if any? Excuse me. What do you do outside of this world? Are you married? Do you have kids? Do you go snowboarding? Do you do anything
I have a
else?
dog. She is curled up and sound asleep right now, but I have a dog named Olive, and she takes up a lot of my time. she's my whole world at the moment. But beyond that, I have friends over at the apartment for game nights every now and then. So even when I'm not working on game shows, naturally, games to some degree are some part of my life. So there's that, and also I'm one of those rare people that made a New Year's resolution and kept it. I resolved last year that I was going to read more, and I really am doing it. And I've amassed a pretty huge collection of books just in the last year. My There are worse things to be addicted to, but my current addiction is a website called thriftbooks.com, which is a website that sells used books. And there's a reader rewards system whereby you get free books as you buy more and more books from them. So I've just been buying books left and right, and I've gotten completely addicted to buying books from this site, thriftbooks.com, which, by the way, does have my books available as well.
That's right. We'll, at the very, very end, we'll mention what some of those books are so people can go and find you and do it. But what's the best book you've read in the past year then? I mean, there's one thing about buying books, another about reading them, and then
yeah.
Yeah.
You know what I got hooked on, and the funniest thing is I'm appreciating the TV that my mother watched more and more. And my mother was a huge fan of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and I never watched it when I was a kid because I figured not my thing. And now what I've begun reading more and more is collections of Alfred Hitchcock short stories. Not short stories that he wrote, but Alfred Hitchcock had this magazine, Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine. Yeah, and they regularly publish paperback collections of the best stories from these, and so that's what I've been snapping up left and right in the past year, is these collections of short stories from the magazine. So not a specific author, but just that genre of short stories that fit the mold of what Alfred Hitchcock Presents would have had. So that's been a lot of the reading that I've done in the past year.
And the last, I promise I will let you go, but the last question for Adam Nedeff is, of all the shows we've talked about, all the game shows, including the Gong Show, including some of the weirder ones, when I was looking this up, apparently there really, really was a game show, not just a couple of years ago, called Hurl. Have you ever come across this show, and what do you think about it?
I have heard of Hurl. It's one of the stranger ideas that I've ever heard of for a game show, but not the strangest. I can tell you what my favorite...
Well, first explain what Hurl is. Hurl is...
It's intestines puke.
They ran for a season. They eat to excess and try not to vomit.
It's quite an elevator pitch, but I mean it's the evil twin of Hot Ones. But yeah, it's a strange idea for a game show, but it's not even the strangest one I've heard. I went over to Ireland last year for a production, and I was watching TV very, very late at night, and I watched a game show from Great Britain from the early 1970s, and it was the strangest show I had ever seen in my life, and it was called The Golden Shot. And this thing was, as I found out, it was a big, big success in Great Britain during the 1960s and 1970s. The show was called The Golden Shot. Let me explain what The Golden Shot was. In the studio, there was a camera that had a loaded crossbow attached to it. The cameraman operating that camera was wearing a blindfold. They would call a viewer at home, and the viewer at home would see a series of targets on the screen. And the viewer at home would have to tell the cameraman, move left, move left, move left. Okay, now tilt the camera up, up, up. No, that's too high. Lower the camera, lower the camera. Okay, now fire. And the cameraman would fire the crossbow whenever the contestant at home told them to fire the crossbow. And you won cash and prizes for every target you were able to hit.
Wow! I mean, that isn't as crazy as Hurl. I mean, it's crazy. That's nuts.
Now, the best part of this is, yes, there was a live studio audience in the studio where this blindfolded man was operating a crossbow. But...
Okay, you're right. That is crazy.
Yeah.
I didn't realize there was a live studio. Humans. Oh, that... Did anybody ever get hurt?
No problems, no issues at all.
Genius. I love it. I figured, that almost sounds like one of those Japanese shows from the 1970s. The Japanese game shows are, we don't even have time to talk about those. But ladies and gentlemen, we've been talking wonderfully with Adam Nedeff. Get his books from Bear Manor Media, but you can also get them from Amazon. Do you have a website? Is there a place people can find you? or
On Facebook, I have a page, Game Show author Adam Nedeff. That's probably the easiest place to find me if you're on Facebook. Yeah, go ahead and pop in anytime you want.
well, yes, and we thank you so much for popping into the neighborhood, Adam Nedeff on Dave's Gone By. Happy gaming to you. What is? This was a great, great interview. Thank you so much, my man.
Thank you.
Bye bye.